Order, and welcome to the Justice Select Committee, a meeting on a Wednesday morning for a pre-appointment hearing, and this is for the members of the committee to consider the appointment of a new chair of the Office of Legal Complaints, which is an appointment by the Legal Services Board. I will ask the preferred candidate to introduce himself, and there will be a series of questions from the committee in a moment. First, the committee members need to give their declarations of interest, starting with Warren Just.
Hello, good morning. I'm Warren Just, Member of Parliament in Wolverhampton West. I'm a solicitor, but not practicing at the moment. I'm a member of various APPGs and also a member of the Central Executive Council of the GMB Trade Union.
Good morning, I'm Lindsay Farnsworth, Member of Parliament for Amber Valley. I was Crown Prosecutor before entering Parliament. My declaration is on the register, but just of relevance today, I'm the co-chair of the APPG of Legal and Constitutional Affairs and a member of the APPG for Access to Justice.
I'm Andy Slaughter, I'm the MP for Hammersmith and Chiswick, and I am a non-practicing barrister. I'm a patron of two charities that Justice rated, the Hammersmith Law Centre and the Upper Room for Ex-Offenders, and I'm a member of the United GMB Trade Unions.
I am Vicky Slade, Member of Parliament for Mid Dorset and North Poole. My interests are, as per the Registrar, none related to this committee.
Morning, Richard. My name's Tessa Munt. I'm the Member of Parliament for Wells and Mendip Hills, which is in Somerset. Everything is on the register, but I will just accentuate the fact that I am a director and the vice chair of Whistleblowers UK, which is a not-for-profit organisation, and I'm also the vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group for penal affairs.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome again, Mr. Blakeway. First, a few general procedural questions from me. Could you just introduce yourself and explain what led you to apply for this role?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the role with the committee. In terms of my background, and then I'll come to the motivation to apply. So, as you're aware, I'm currently a housing ombudsman, which is a different public appointment. That's a role that I've been doing now for almost 7 years, and I was appointed after the devastating events at Grenfell Tower. One of the things which I did shortly after I was appointed to my current role was meet with survivors and bereaved families from that disaster, and hearing the injustice that they'd experienced had a profound impact on me, as it would anyone. 3 years later, I was in a coroner's inquest into the death of Awad Bishak in Rochdale, and before giving evidence at that inquest, I listened to his parents and hearing about their experiences and how they'd been dismissed and ignored through a complaints process. Putting those things together, those have led to being catalysts for significant change at the Housing Ombudsman. New statutory powers, a new scheme, a new operating model. And that experience is part of my motivation for wanting to chair the Office for Legal Complaints, given the role of the legal ombudsman, and also, from what I can see, some real system pressures within the legal sector. I have other experience which is relevant. I was chair of the Ombudsman Association for 3 years. I'm a member of the Administrative Justice Council. Prior to all of those roles, I've worked in housing regeneration and public policy, and I was also an election observer in Ukraine and Somaliland with the OECD. I think anyone who applies for a role needs to think about, well, what contribution can they make and what difference can they make? And I think when I applied for this one, I was really clear from the start, there are 3 areas where I really wanted to focus. Access to justice, which I know is something the committee cares about. Systemic change, so complaints being more than individual transactions but tools for learning as well and change. And also transformation in terms of performance and of the Ombudsman service. So that was very clear in my mind then, and that's my motivation for doing this role.
Thank you very much. Just remind us how much time you expect the role to take up of your working week, and whether you have plans to continue or to take on any other professional or voluntary commitments.
So the role is a minimum of 60 days a year. I don't envisage that it would be 60 days. I think it would be more than that. I would want it to be more than that. But I think even if it was twice that, it would be still less than half, less than a working week. So I would envisage doing things which are compatible and appropriate alongside it. And certainly, I still, a trustee of the British Library, for example.
I think that is in your application to the British Library. There's nothing else at the moment which you're.
No.
And when do your current responsibilities as housing ombudsman end?
So I complete my second term as the ombudsman on the 31st of July. So there is a period of potentially of overlap, given it's envisaged that I would be appointed dependent on this part of the process on the 1st of April. I've had a conversation with both the Legal Services Board and, of course, the Housing Ombudsman Service itself, and it's considered that it's compatible to do the 2 roles alongside each other for the 16-week period. And actually, there's some precedent for that of people being involved with 2 kind of ombudsman services. All right, this is the Office of Legal Complaints.
And you filled in a questionnaire in relation to previous positions in which you noted that you've been appointed to positions by the Prime Minister, Ministers and the Mayor of London. These have been subject to political restrictions. Could you explain what those restrictions were? Yes,
absolutely. So obviously my current role is an appointment made by the Secretary of State, and it's a politically restricted role. I worked at the Greater London Authority. I was one of the appointments that the Mayor of London can make under the GLA Act. It was Section 67, I think, of the GLA Act. But that has political restrictions. So you couldn't be a candidate, you couldn't speak in a public forum on behalf of a political party, So those are the kind of restrictions that apply to that role.
Do you have, or when did you last have any political activities yourself, either membership or responsibilities within specific within a political role?
So I completed the question. So in the last 5 years, as you know, I've had no political activities. Looking further back, I'd say my involvement has always been pretty limited politically. I think I was the last member of a political party. It will be about 10 years ago. And I'm not currently a member of a political party and do not envisage being one either.
Okay. And have you ever been, lots of people members of a political party, have you ever been active in a political party or in political roles?
Yeah, I mean, very, very long time ago. I was active, for example, in student politics when I was at university in the late 1990s. But I haven't been like an agent or a councillor or anything like that.
Thank you, Tessamond.
Thank you. I don't want to be at all rude, but I'm not sure that Chair of the Office of Legal Complaints is a job that many people would have heard of, certainly in the general public. And I just wondered if you might be able to explain what the role involves and how it relates to the legal ombudsman. Please.
No, of course. I don't think that's a rude question. And I think you're right. It's not a household name. but it does an incredibly important role which probably affects people's lives without them realising. The Office for Legal Complaints is obviously part of the architecture that exists around legal services, established as part of the Legal Services Act back in 2007. And it's, I see it as having a dual role. So its primary role, which most people will look at it doing, is to provide the governance for the Legal Ombudsman Service. So it's a scheme administrator or commissions the scheme. And the legal ombudsman can resolve any disputes which come to it involving a regulated provider. And therefore, what the office will do is establish the scheme, and if there's any scheme changes to be made, it can do that through a process. It will set the budget. It will monitor performance. It will do all of the good governance that you would expect it to do around audit and risk and financial controls and so on. It also appoints, crucially, it appoints the chief ombudsman as well. The other, I said it was a dual role, though, because I think the other part of it, which perhaps is focused on less, but I think it's so important, is that it is part of that complex architecture of bodies within established by the Legal Services Act, and it has to ensure that it makes its contribution on the regulatory objectives that have been set out in that Act. And those are really, really important around the rule of law, around public access to legal services, around professionalism in legal services. And I think there's so much that an ombudsman service can do to provide insight that can contribute to the better performance of a system. And there's so much that it can do to contribute to the insight that regulators need, the data and information. And so I think the Office for Legal Complaints has a really important role also in ensuring that there's a framework for providing that information to the system for regulators, others, and indeed the services themselves to perform and improve.
Your expertise and experience in that area, some of it you've referred to already. Is there anything you'd like to highlight in particular?
Well, as the current housing ombudsman, we have been part of a significant change to the regulatory landscape in relation to social housing following Grenfell Tower. So I think that's the most immediate and relevant example. Our powers were changed as part of the Social Housing Regulation Act that came into force passed in 2023, and that saw our role change in isolation. So we had new powers, for example, powers to establish a statutory local complaint handling process, code of practice there, to undertake systemic investigations. But also also a memorandum of understanding with the regulator for social housing. Alongside that, we also have a separate relationship with the building safety regulator. So that required working very closely with those regulatory bodies and working closely with officials, parliamentarians and others as part of that changing regulatory settlement. So I think I have a good experience of a very immediate experience of working with regulators, and a more extensive experience, if you go back, of working with several stakeholders. And sometimes stakeholders where there's tension, they've got different things that they want to do. So it's not necessarily a kind of universal or my period of working at the GLA involved working with a whole range of different bodies, including regulators.
And I wondered about your experience of the legal services sector generally and regulatory environment in which they operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, as you'll know, there are 8 regulators under the Legal Services Act. Some of those bodies are ones which I've had a relationship with already as part of my current role. And so three bodies which I've done work with over the last few years: Ministry of Justice, Solicitors Regulation Authority, and some contact with the Law Society. Now that's those are actually very important bodies, clearly in terms of the work of the legal ombudsman. The majority of the casework that the legal ombudsman handles would be solicitor-based, for instance. So some relationships there already. There will be other bodies within the, and other regulators who I've not had a relationship with previously, and I look forward to establishing one, and I think I've got good experience of doing that.
And what do you think is going to be the most difficult bit of your job? What's the most challenging thing?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think there are many challenges, but thinking of the system, I think one of the big challenges is changing perceptions. I think there's quite a lot of tension, and I think it's a kind of sometimes what I describe as slightly unhealthy commentary, around things. So I think that which no one wants. So I think there is something about changing that relationship. Now, that involves listening to those bodies and their concerns. I think a lot of it has come down to the focus on the performance of the legal ombudsman, where I think the legal ombudsman itself has probably performed better, from what I can see, than it's sometimes given credit for. But it's not performed, and there's a lot of hard work and dedication gone into that by the people there, but it's not performed as well as it needs to, and it knows that. And it's cost more, and that creates tension. But I also think there needs to be a bit of reflection out there and kind of self-reflection out there, because one of the things which has really struck me through this process looking at it is that 28% of the cases the legal ombudsman receives, the complainant says they've never got a final response from the legal provider. Now that is not an experience I would have in social housing. For all the challenges in social housing, which you'll be very aware of, that doesn't happen. I would have thought it would be less than 1% of the cases that we see where there hasn't been a final response. So that suggests there's some kind of cultural and behavioural issues there, and also suggests that, if you're not seeing that happen on the handling, then you're not going to elevate complaints to make them more than transactions but tools for learning. So I think there's a bit of reflection also needed in the system on, well, what's the role and purpose for complaints, and how actually do we ensure that the ombudsman is not a surrogate for effective local complaint handling.
So the chief ombudsman has been in role for a month, I think. So can I just ask you how you think your role differs from that of the chief ombudsman, and how you might work together?
Absolutely. So I think I've had the benefit of meeting the chief ombudsman already, and hopefully, subject to the outcome of the process, I really look forward to working with them. I think in an ideal world, you wouldn't have a new chair and a new chief ombudsman at the same time, but that's the way that's happened, and but it's also an opportunity for kind of fresh perspectives, to be brought together. I think the roles are really clear and different. So the first thing and the clearest thing, and one of the things which I did say to the chief ombudsman when I met them, is that I am not the ombudsman, and I am really clear about that. And I'm also clear that I'm aware that perceptions coming into this role potentially as a current ombudsman, I want to make that absolutely clear. And the decisions are matters for the chief ombudsman and his team. And it's really important that either the chair or the board do not get involved in that work. I think clearly our work is to do what a good board would do, which is to provide, test and challenge, strategic direction, have a focus on culture as well, and the people within the organisation, and making sure that there's the right support there. And so that's our work, if you like, internally, of providing the absolute proper oversight and making sure that we're doing things in the way that should be happening under managing public money, the FREM and so on. There's then the external environment, and I think there's a touch point there, because there is an expectation on the chair that there is kind of engagement in the system, and obviously there's formal relationships which are set out in lots of memorandums and tripartite agreements with the MOJ and the LSB, and those are really important relationships, and they will be with the wider regulators. So those are relationships that I think the chair has to, have a critical role on as envisaged. But there's a much wider stakeholder piece. I would really hope that, alongside me and independently on their own, the Chief Ombudsman also has the bandwidth to be active there as well.
Thank you. I've got one last question, one of my favourites, this actually, and that is, so the role is described as being home-based, but it requires significant attendance at the Legal Ombudsman office in Birmingham. So have you thought about how many days a week you might attend in Birmingham, or how, are you going to go there every week, or are you going to go there in blocks of time? Have you thought about how that might work in practice?
So I've got very clear principles. So I can't give you a quota of days because I need to understand more about how the rhythms and the meetings work. Other than that, I think clearly board meetings should be in person. And I think the current chair, and I really like this, and the current chair established a practice that when there's a board meeting, that during the lunch break, all staff are invited to have lunch with the board, and I think that's such a good thing to have established. And I think Elizabeth's done a really smart thing there. So I'd like to be visible. I'd like to be present. I'd like to be present and visible not only in Birmingham but also in Leeds and also in Cardiff, where there are the hubs. In addition to the board meetings being in person and rotating between those locations, I would like to spend as much time as possible in person in those places. I know the Chief Ombudsman lives near the Leeds office, so has a it's very present there. I'd like to do the same. So I would hope the majority of the time certainly is a kind of in-person commitment, but I need to work through what proportion.
Can I just ask you a very personal question? That is, how long would it take you to travel to Birmingham from wherever it is you're based?
I'm based in London, so roughly we're looking at a couple of hours, 90 minutes, couple of hours here.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've already talked to some degree about the tensions and your relationships with some of the regulatory bodies, but and you've been really clear about the importance of stakeholder engagement. But I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about the how. How do you plan on engaging with specifically the legal sector who got this tension and those regulators that you don't already have a relationship with?
So I think there are different touch points, and I think, and again, this is, something which I need to understand and get into in more detail, but but there will be some which are led, if you like, by the legal ombudsman themselves, and then there are some which are led by the office or the chair. So one of the things which I'm aware the legal ombudsman itself has done is establish a regulatory forum, and I think it did that relatively recently, possibly in this financial year or the previous one, but it's relatively recent, as a way of convening the regulators together as a group and being able to engage with them. So I think that's good, and so as chair, I'd like to understand, well, how's that work?
Yeah.
What do you get from that? And then are there any gaps? As someone new coming into the role, hopefully, I would want to obviously reach out to all of those bodies. And hopefully be able to meet with the leadership of those bodies and understand what their relationship has been like and understand how to develop that relationship further, and also the nuances between them, because there will be nuances, and I need, I then think there is something that I would really like the board to look at and to talk to the board about, which is beyond the individual relationships and the kind of the personal contacts, some of which will be formal, some of which will be more informal. I'd really like to understand, well, what is the information that we're providing to the system and to them? And I, because there is, there is the individual casework and the budget, which will be a large focus of the conversation, I'm sure. But there is this thing about the information that's been provided into the system. So the example of SSB, which you'll be aware of, there's been shocks in the legal system with Axiom and SSB. You'll have seen the report that the LSB published last week, I think, in relation to the SRA. Clearly, there were complaints there. And those complaints came over to the legal ombudsman, but those complaints were also indicating issues. So I think, adopting the principle that complaints can provide that insight, can be an early warning indicator, might be the kind of canary in the coal mine, which is all the stuff that we've sought to do at the Housing Ombudsman. I'd really like to understand how we develop the framework for information sharing within that system. And that is a conversation I would like to have with the board, with the legal ombudsman, but also with those regulators and other bodies to understand, well, what is the insight and intelligence that we can provide? And I'd really like to see a step change in what we do. The legal ombudsman is doing some really great stuff at the moment. I think I've read it, I've seen it, I think some of it is really innovative and really high quality, but there's so much more that could be achieved.
I just touch on something you said earlier on about social housing complaints, and they're almost entirely they have an outcome and then they come to the ombudsman, whereas you were saying in this case a lot of the cases don't have a final outcome. What do you think the relationship is between the complainant and the sector? How is that different in the legal sector as it is in the housing sector? Because as a non-lawyer, there is a deference to the legal sector which you probably don't have with the housing sector. Do you think that's that? Because you talked about the supply side on the stakeholders, but what about the other side of the stakeholders? The consumer, who's actually, the litigant, who's actually been failed. What do you see your relationship in helping to improve the system by engaging with that set of stakeholders?
I agree there is a difference, although there may be more commonality than at first it appears. So, and I talked about the difference between the 28% that is wasn't the case always the case in social housing that certainly predating our code of practice that you would have seen some of those same behaviours of people not getting responses, complaints not being registered, and all of that. And some of that will still go on now, but far less. There's far more discipline. So in social housing, I'd say one of the big challenges there is the imbalance of power. However poor the service, wherever the outcome of the complaint, you're probably still going to live with the same landlord. And that was an inhibitor on people raising complaints because they didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker, they would be worried about being evicted and so on. So I think that deference, as you referred to it, kind of existed in social housing. I think you are seeing behaviour change starting within legal services where obviously you have choice, more choice. But some people have more choice than other people, and there's some big challenges around unregulated bodies, given that it's not a reserved matter, legal advice is not a reserved matter. There's some real issues there. And certainly one of the indicators you could look at that the LSB publishes on is what's described as silent sufferers. Go back a few years, 2020 I think, 36% of people who feel that their case wasn't handled well by the legal service wouldn't make a complaint. Right. Now it's about 26%. So you're starting to see people feeling more empowered and pushing a bit more, which is and legal services need to respond to that and think differently about that. I think the gap that exists at the moment, and the really big difference that exists at the moment, is the discipline and the structure and the framework around local complaint handling. There is a models complaint procedure which the legal ombudsman has produced. That's really, really good. And there is back to your question about conversations with the regulatory bodies and the representative bodies, I think there is something about how do we go much further on that and get that really embedded into practices. Because I think that there's a pilot planned at the moment, but we need to see a real step change there. Because that's definitely what I've seen happen in social housing. Right. Is complaints was sometimes seen as a bit of a sideshow. There's a bit of reluctance to invest in them. It's taking money.
Box.
Yeah, exactly. And I think now that mindset has actually shifted. Overall, has shifted, and we need to see the same happening in legal services.
You mentioned the budget. You mentioned that's going to take up a fair amount of time. First of all, do you think it's likely to be approved? And if you're not sure it's going to be approved, how are you likely to be able to respond to that? What's Plan B?
I think that's where are we at the moment? So the budget itself has been led by the current chair and the board. So the stage they're at is that they've got a budget proposal which is going to be considered by the Legal Services Board later this month, and then it's into MOJ. So we're now at the very late stage of the budget, and obviously if it is not approved, then there is clearly implications for the ability of the legal ombudsman to handle casework in a timely and effective way. I mean, because it has experienced a kind of 30% increase in complaint volumes. So, the reality is that you need investment to be able to manage that, but you also need the organisation needs to go through a transformation. It's done lots of really positive work, and but I would describe it as evolutionary compared to the transformative work that needs to happen. I think one thing that it's really important that stakeholders and the representative body see about the role of the OLC is obviously to propose a budget that means that the scheme can be fulfilled and delivered, but it's also there to ensure value for money. It's there to make sure that performance is happening. So it's part of the kind of assurance process, if you like, for the system that this is working, that this is money that's been invested sensibly and well and is needed. So I do think it's important to look at it in both ways. There's both proposing the budget but also ensuring that value is being delivered. Consequence if it doesn't happen, I think that is a really important thing actually to consider on the risk register for the organisation. What's the implications of certain things not happening? The most immediate thing is you would end up with a backlog that's not being tackled, and that will lead to further breakdown in trust.
Given you're coming in at the end of a process, and you've been really clear about your priorities being about access to justice, the systemic change and transformative performance, if that is at risk, how do you see your ability to be able to achieve your outcomes? 12.1% increase is quite a lot of money in a difficult financial climate for the members to accept as an increase in what they're paying. So, do you think that your ambition is in someone else's hands because you're not the one that's actually able to secure that budget? Presumably, that's going to happen before you do the transition across, or are you going to be able to personally influence that at this stage in the process?
It will have been considered by the LSB before the 1st of April. So whilst there is still a role for the MOJ, you're in the place where that budget is very close to being finalised. I accept that absolutely the position that we're in. There is there would clearly be an impact, were it not approved, there would be an impact in terms of what could happen around transformation, particularly the potential for digital and AI, which I know is a very, very strong part of of the transformation programme that Legal Ombudsman needs to go through. So that would be the immediate risk there. There then have to be some difficult choices around the casework. I think one area which I'm very keen to look at is and explore with the Chief Ombudsman and for the board to look at is what happens around in-depth investigations, which is obviously where the cost will be. About 51% of cases, from what I can see, are going into in-depth investigations, full investigations. Now, part of the reason for that is because of of the complainant not receiving a final response. So part of it is that, but also there will be issues around complexity there or customer vulnerability. So I think a lot of focus is going on, if you like, quite rightly, on the front end. How can there be earlier resolution? And I think you've really seen a change in the performance of Legal Ombudsman. This year, I understand it's averaging 63 days to complete a case through its early resolution. That is really good. That is really good. But the challenge is the in-depth, which is the other side of the coin, is the in-depth. But it's also the in-depth which is going to have some of the gnarliest issues, obviously some of the most challenging issues, but also some of the richest learning to come from it. And that's where I'd like a real focus. And without more budget, you're not going to get the focus there.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Werinda.
Thank you, Mr. Blakeway. We've already had quite a detailed discussion about the legal ombudsman. You will be aware, hopefully, that the committee is carrying out an inquiry into access to justice. Have you made an assessment as to the significance and role of the legal ombudsman in facilitating access to justice?
Yes, and I am aware of the committee's inquiry. I've watched some of the evidence sessions that you've had. I've read some of the written submissions, and I look forward to seeing the report. And I think it's a really timely inquiry that the committee is doing. You asked about my assessment, so I think a couple of thoughts. So I think the first one is around that has been highlighted, I can see from some of the evidence. For example, Legal Services Consumer Panel has highlighted this. It's not just around unmet need, but also unregulated bodies and the gaps in the redress system there, jurisdictional gaps, which is, I think, a real concern and valid. There's then, well, what is the experience of people who do have access to redress? And I've highlighted, obviously, there needs to be a step change in the effectiveness of local complaint handling, and there's very clear evidence around that. So that needs to, I think, be a focus for the system. I think there's then the kind of how do all the different bodies work together? And I have thought about this a lot, actually, because I went back and looked at, well, what's the origins of the Legal Services Act? I hope that this is not going too broad from your question, the Legal Services Act. And there was the review by Clementi, for example, that led to, the white paper and then the Act. And I was struck in that around the consolidation of redress that happened in the Legal Ombudsman, which I think is kind of, but then the creation of the other bodies. And I think it's how does that Legal Ombudsman and the Office for Legal Complaints work with those other bodies? And that's why I come back to the idea that the insight that the Ombudsman produces is part of the insight that the Office can provide to the system as part of meeting its regulatory obligations. And I think we're only just at the start of what really could be drawn out from that. And that is so important, I think, for building trust in legal services, because trust very clearly trust can be fragile in legal services.
You would also be aware, excuse me, that complaints to the legal ombudsman are higher than ever. So do you think that the legal ombudsman should be doing more to encourage providers to improve? And also, have you identified any particular areas of poor practice that you think that should be targeted? You did mention that there are 28% of legal complaints are to do with not having had a response from the provider, and I remember from my experience in private practice that was a major cause of complaints. But have you identified any other areas of poor practice, and it could be explanation of fees or anything like that you think that the legal ombudsman should be looking at in conjunction with trying to get the providers to improve their services?
Yes, I think there absolutely there is there. So I think there is, clearly the ombudsman needs to go through a transformation to handle a rising volume of casework. But I think it's absolutely right to focus on, what is the causes of those complaints? Now, in a way, it's important to change the mindset around complaints to make sure you have what I would describe as a positive complaint handling culture. So it's not defensive or dismissive about complaints, but recognises, look, if something's gone wrong, it's an opportunity to put it right and to learn from it. And you need to have that kind of non-defensive mindset. And also, I would say for the legal ombudsman, if more people are coming to that service, which they are, then that shows a level of trust and shows the difference it can make, and shows that there's more insight that can then be provided to the system, and that's positive as well. You've got the 28%, you've got 100 of people reporting they're not getting a final response. You've got 120% increase in casework since the pandemic, and you've got, I believe now, an average of uphold rate of 70%. So a sort of service failure of 70% from the investigations. Those are three really striking facts that need to be reflected on by the system. In terms of areas of what causation, so there are some areas where we know there's higher volumes, residential conveyancing, wills, probate. So there's areas where you're seeing more traffic, if you like, coming to the ombudsman, and then you're seeing consistent issues for reasons for service failure. So poor communication, delays, failure to advise. And then within some specific areas, there will be issues around fees and costs and transparency, and that's obviously a big thing in the system at the moment. One thing which I've been struck by is looking at SSB actually, and you've got to recognise I've got a fairly limited amount of information at the moment, but looking at SSB, it's a regulatory requirement around indemnity and after the event insurance and things like that. But from what I understand, a number of the issues involving the cases that are coming to the ombudsman are about that. And so I think that's, again, a really good example of, not only what can you learn in relation to that provider, but also what lessons does it provide more widely, and then what lessons does it provide for kind of regulatory requirements. And I think there's a really positive conversation I think could be had about, what information could be provided as part of the transparency work that the Ombudsman's already started, which the office has some oversight of. It has a committee which looks at public interest reports, for example, and approves those publications. Well, how far can that go, and what is it that data that can be captured and provided to address some of the reoccurring reasons for people having to escalate their cases to the legal ombudsman?
You've already mentioned the high increase in the level of complaints. Number one, how are you going to manage that? And number two, why do you think we've had this high level increase in the number of complaints? I hate to think that legal providers are getting worse at doing their job. So why do you think we've got this massive increase in the number of complaints, and how do you think that you'd be able to manage that?
There we go.
So my, based on what I know at the moment, which is largely what will be in the public domain, so based on my interpretation of that, I think the reasons for the increase in complaints, some will be societal. So most ombudsman services, certainly the housing ombudsman, would report a rising volume of casework, and that is reflective of changes in consumer behaviour, digitisation, awareness of rights, a sense of empowerment. So I think there is a societal change around complaint handling and people more likely to complain. There will then be things which are more specific to to legal services in this instance.
Excuse me, when you say societal, do you mean that the customers, as it were, the clients, are becoming more aware of their rights?
Yeah.
Okay.
More aware, less, and they don't want to be fobbed off. I think and then I think there will be things specific for legal services, which are, again, I think this is part of changing kind of perceptions of the way in which complaints can help. Is that it's a changing and challenging environment for a lot of legal providers, and moves towards law tech, more competition. There are structural changes which are happening within legal services. Some of that will, that poor practice will be resulting in more cases coming to the ombudsman, and I think So I think it's about providing information on what I would describe as kind of thematic trends, and then it's about targeted interventions in the areas where you're seeing particular spikes or increases or outliers. And I think that's a role for the Ombudsman to do both. It's the role of the OLC to ensure that there's a framework in place to be able to do that, and the resources in place, and that it's performing effectively in fulfilling that function.
So I understand it takes about 11 months for investigations to start, and yes, you've mentioned resources, but how is the legal ombudsman going to adapt to having to deal with this increase? I mean, are there any other ideas that you have as to how that might be managed?
So you're right. I mean, I think despite clear improvements, I think overall the time taken on cases has reduced by about 22%, I understand, this financial year. So there is a clear trajectory of improvement. It's not where it needs to be. And very clearly, the longer it takes to investigate, not only does that have an impact on the individuals, but it also means there's a delay in providing timely insight to the system and to those providers. I think in terms of what can be done, so there are many things in train at the moment. And I think the next financial year, and it's part of the budget consultation, a lot of that is putting in place things which have been thought through and worked through. For example, there was a lean exercise to make sure that processes were efficient, and it's embedding some of the recommendations from that exercise, which I think are really positive. I think the second area, so some of it's about that process change. I think the second area is then, which is more in the transformative space potentially, is really looking at, well, what is the potential for artificial intelligence within the Ombudsman and digitisation? And I think that, it's something which many ombudsman services are looking at. It's something which we're looking at, the housing ombudsman. I've had conversations with the financial ombudsman, with the parliamentary ombudsman. There's a lot of interest there. So I think that potentially can really help. People are vitally important, and individual caseworkers are vitally important, but it's about empowering them and supporting them and unlocking their potential. And then I think the third area, where I don't know enough at the moment, but hopefully it's one that I can explore, is what happens around in-depth investigations. Because I know there has been an improvement there. I believe that this financial year there's been a 10% increase in the number of in-depth investigations closed. That's good, but there needs to be a greater step change there. And I really want to understand, well, what process improvements can be made specifically around in-depth investigations.
Thank you, Mr. Blakeway. Final question from me. There are high levels of sickness absence within the legal ombudsman's department. So what steps will you take to manage the well-being of staff there?
Yeah, I worry about that. You're right. I think I think sickness is about like 12 days, I think, averaging 12 days, which would be above the average. So that you would expect in the service. So I worry about that. And also attrition. I think there's an attrition of about 11%, which, again, I would worry about. So the first thing has been really clear with the Chief Ombudsman about actually, we need to make sure that we've got a healthy, motivated colleagues and a real focus on well-being. So I think there's something about being really clear with the Chief Ombudsman around that. I then think there's the role of the board is to get assurance around the people strategy. I don't know yet when that strategy was last looked at. But it's understanding that people strategy and how, if we're seeing new challenges, mental health, new challenges, like how does it address that? And then it's what's the reporting that will come through the committee, there is a people committee, and then to the main board around the key indicators such as sickness, attrition, and so on. And how do we see an improvement there? I think there has been, from what I can see, I think there has been some improvement. So I think attrition has reduced, sickness has reduced, but it's obviously not where it needs to be. So it's clarity with the Chief Ombudsman around this being a priority. It's the people strategy and stress testing that, and then it's regular reporting and seeing a clear trajectory of improvement.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, but Lindsay, do you want to go in?
I think it will be quick. I just wanted to return to the increased demand and the increasing levels of complaints, and I think conveyancing has been identified as a big area where that's increased. And I just wondered whether you're aware of any work that has gone in to look at the reasoning behind that, and whether there's any correlation with the increased number of in-house conveyancers or conveyancers online who use almost a tick box system on the computer, and whether there's any correlation between the increased number of those services and the increased complaints.
Yeah, because it's a significant area of demand on the Ombudsman service. I've looked at it a bit, and I would absolutely encourage the Ombudsman to look at what more it can do to provide insight to the sector. I think it has done some work, actually, over quite a long period of time. So it did a report around stamp duty changes to try and get ahead of those changes, and the report was aimed at being preventative. What good practice could be adopted to prevent complaints. And there was a report which is quite old now, but I read, which is really good, by a previous ombudsman on residential conveyancing. And at the moment, I believe residential conveyancing is about 36% of complaints. So it is a real area for focus. So what are the issues? So I think from what I understand, causes hidden fees, delays, poor communication. I believe about half the complaints can actually be resolved through the early resolution route. So that suggests that fairly straightforward steps could be taken at a local level to provide a satisfactory outcome for the complainant, and those cases not to escalate to the Ombudsman. So there's probably some quick wins that could be adopted. And then I think there's some insights which are need to be explored further for how legal services are changing. So, for example, online legal services, which has changed beyond residential conveyancing, much more, people using those, customer behaviour is changing, people using those, and they may look cost effective, but then potentially they result in delays, or there's those hidden costs. So there's probably something there, I think, which is where you're seeing it in residential conveyancing, but it's much broader than that, about the way in which legal services are evolving and what it actually means for the customer, and the customer being really clear about actually what the implications might be for them. That is work that the Ombudsman needs to do to provide insight to the system. What I think the job of the OLC is to do is to make sure that there's a framework in place for that activity to happen, and then for that information to be provided to the right actors.
The complaints on conveyancing tend to be more about communication and fees rather than whether the advice was correct or not, or would that not come to you?
It would. Failure to advise would certainly come. That has not been flagged to me. I think this is one where the Ombudsman, the Chief Ombudsman and his team are responsible for the decisions and will be able to establish what the insight is. I think the job of the Chair, the Board and the OLC is to make sure there's a framework in place for that being shared in the system.
Yes, on the same topic of residential conveyancing, I just wondered whether your experience as the Housing Ombudsman had given you some insight into why it is, you said 36% of those complaints, whether you know anything as being the Housing Ombudsman that informs you as to why that might be?
It will be more limited than it would seem, because housing redress has kind of been salami sliced. I know from my time as the Ombudsman Association Chair, across many sectors, there can be really fragmented routes to redress for people, and it is a real issue. It's a real issue. So typically it would be the Ombudsman that deal with agents, so the Property Ombudsman Service, or the New Homes Ombudsman for new build, or some new build, who would probably see those issues more than the Housing Ombudsman. We will see some, though, and typically I would say we probably see it in the space of, say, shared ownership, for example. And I think, and I can definitely, from what I know on what the legal ombudsman has seen, see parallels. So, hidden costs, delays in the process. Typically what we would see at the Housing Ombudsman is someone who will say, my landlord was too slow providing the information to my solicitor, which then meant I, incurred additional stamp duty or the sale fell through. So I'd probably see it from the landlord's action side rather than from the solicitor's side. But yeah, you can see the kind of delays in the system very much occur there as well.
Thank you. Thank you for being so honest. And then just one very quick one, and that is the legal ombudsman has evidence that the development and use of generative AI in complaints is increasing the volume of complaints in themselves and their level of detail. How might you respond to that?
I think that's absolutely right. I've seen that elsewhere. And we would say at the Housing Ombudsman we're seeing potentially the use of generative AI. And sometimes, unfortunately for the customer, that's kind of, there's two sides to this. So on the one hand, it can help people access the system who might struggle otherwise because of, English not being their first language, low literacy, something like that. So it can be a positive. But unfortunately, sometimes we see, bits of statute or things, incorporated into the complaint which just aren't relevant or are wrong. So there's a kind of, now it might be, obviously this is still relatively early in terms of adoption, so that will ease through the system. But right now, people are accessing, but what they're bringing is actually, potentially going to struggle to get through the system because it's misconceived. I know some ombudsmen have started to provide advice to users, to potential complainants, to say, look, use it, but you need to then check it. This is how to support to check it, and so on. So I know some ombudsmen have done that, which is interesting. Maybe there's something in that.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Just while we're on that subject of AI, so are you saying that you think it can be used to process complaints, and is that just in a summarising role, or is it in a decision-making role as well?
I think it could be both, potentially, but obviously caution needs to be exercised. And I think, and I really would like to, where I appointed, I'd really like to understand what the digital strategy is of the legal ombudsman and the adoption of AI. I think there is a huge potential there, but very clearly eyes need to be open around it. I think there's something about establishing a kind of ethical frame. If I could just build off your question, I think there's something about establishing an ethical framework around the use of AI. So, for example, transparency, that you're using it. Also, it's perfectly possible for employees to just use it themselves, independent of the organisation, as part of their job. So there's getting the right guardrails around that and so on. And then it's how you use it in your process. And I think what's more common, certainly what we've done at the Housing Ombudsman, is making the process more efficient rather than necessarily using it as drafting decisions or even making decisions, either drafting or making the decisions. For example, file preparation. A really key element of an ombudsman process and can be a real challenge. For the Housing Ombudsman, it takes twice as long for us to prepare the case file as it does investigate the case. So anything you can do to use technology to make those processes more efficient, very positive. And AI in file preparation and so on is really sorting documents and so on, really valuable. On drafting decisions, I think it does have a role actually. But then it's what's your quality assurance around that? Your quality control and quality assurance. And there are some areas which are more difficult. Compensation, I know, for example, is more difficult to do, and large language models, can struggle with, at this stage, can struggle with that. And that's where it's about augmenting your processes rather than replacing your process or replacing your people. And that's where I think absolutely the more that you can free up the capacity of your people to then exercise those judgments around the decisions and remedies, that's really important. But you're not going to get them. I don't think you're at the stage where you're going to get a totally automated process and the machines issuing the decisions independently.
Another sort of issue arising out of rising demand. The OFC is proposing a scheme transformation review, and we noted that the Legal Services Consumer Panel has said that the Ombudsman needs radical reform. Is that what the role of the scheme transformation review is, and is it going to work?
So I agree with the point around radical change. And the scheme transformation is a critical element of that, subject to obviously the budget being approved for it to happen. At the moment, the information I have is largely the information that's available in the public domain, so it's fairly limited. But the next 12 months is really what I described as a kind of discovery phase around what scheme transformation could achieve. I think there are some elements within it, which is around the fee regime and the levy, which could help drive behaviour change at a local level, given some of the issues highlighted, and then some of it about changes within the Ombudsman Service itself and the way it does things. I think some of the tests that you would want to apply, in my mind, where I am at the moment thinking about it, you'd want to... There's 3 tests that I would want to apply to the kind of success of it. When you ask, will it work? 3 tests for success. Access, does it help improve access? Agility, does it allow the Ombudsman to respond more rapidly to changes in demand? And automation, as we've just touched on.
Thank you very much. Finally, a question for Lindsay Farnsworth.
Thank you. I want to go back to the use of AI and automation. You've just talked about that and within the service. And I know that in your questionnaire response, you also talked about the future operating model embedding automation, AI and modern digital tools. So I just wondered how you might go about bringing that operating model into use.
Yeah, so I think, bearing in mind I've got limited information on what the legal ombudsman has done yet, but So I think the first thing is that digital strategy needs to also be a data strategy. So one, I think the key challenge is to make sure the data and the information that any applications might learn from or on which based decisions is really robust and there's data integrity. So I think that's a really large part of it and a kind of a key enabler of any digital strategy. So I think there's something about the OLC receiving assurance around data integrity and robustness to then enable that strategy. In terms of strategy, I then think it's in embedding it in an operating model. I think there's different routes you can take. So I think the first one is to understand, well, actually, what system is casework management system, for example, is the Ombudsman currently operating off, and is that the route you take and you build off it? So there will be some organisations who would say their digital strategy is a kind of Microsoft first approach, and so you build off it. There's then a series of kind of discrete interventions which I think you can make, for example, around cloud-based systems, which are more straightforward to embed in into an operating model. I think one of the big things for me, and it really speaks to the customer's experience, is the channels for reaching an ombudsman. So there'll be a big push, I'm sure, for digital first, if digital by default. And there's two things with that. One, which you'll be very aware of, which is, well, what about if you haven't got access to that? And so every ombudsman service, and this one would need to be really aware, well, what happens for the people? But also for people changing channel, because I think there are some people that will largely do things digitally, and then they'll suddenly use a different channel, the phone, for that particular contact or that transaction. Because they think they'll get a different outcome, a better outcome, or they've waited a long time, so now they're going to pick up the phone because they're fed up of using, the online system. And the challenge can be that the systems are not necessarily integrated, so the operating model hasn't integrated those systems. And that's where things start to fall between the cracks, or the customer service is kind of impaired. So I think it's something about channels, but also channel integration and then system integration as part of that operating model. But it's really early for me at the moment to understand that, but there is real potential there, and it absolutely would change the operating model.
Do you have anything from your time as the housing ombudsman that you could bring to that process, that any good practice that you want to bring forward?
Yes, there's some. So we're doing our own digital and data changes, and we've changed some parts of our process, which has been very digitally led. But as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think it's getting the right process, minimising the number of handovers, for example, is a key part, I think, to an ombudsman process. Someone goes through, you can be too many handovers. So it's sorting out all of that, and then seeing how it can be augmented by the digital. And that's where, for example, we've looked at our triaging of casework and how we do that, and then we thought, well, how can the digital help us on file preparation? So it's kind of the other area, which I just briefly, on the time that I've been on the board of the British Library, you may be aware the library experienced quite an extensive cyber attack, which completely, obviously very challenging time for it. So as a board member there's been a lot of focus around cyber security, as you'd expect. And, I have to say I've used some of that insight in my work at the Housing Ombudsman, and obviously with, clearly a risk that the OLC will need to consider is, cyber security as part of a more digital-based service. So I think that's relevant and helpful, hopefully.
Yeah, not an experience that people would want to receive, but probably useful going forward. So,
yeah.
Brilliant. One last question from me, and I just wanted to go back to the SSB law group and
the current approach to legal services complaints handling and the legal ombudsman's role within that, because I know that the legal services consumer panel had said that that it seems to be the complaints handling seems to be a little siloed between different bodies, and they feel that smarter integrated regulation would be useful. So I'm just wondering what your reflections would be following the SSB law group in the way that complaints are handled.
So I think in the way that the Legal Services Act was set up, it made a clear distinction between redress and misconduct. And I think that's kind of right. So it's matters for the SRA around kind of misconduct, but redress clearly sits with the legal ombudsman. I think in a system and for customers' experience, what's really important is, that there's a kind of approach of no wrong door. So, there shouldn't be a great onus on the individual to navigate their way through a system to go to the right place. Those actors should work together to make sure that the right information is in the right place and that person is, navigating the right way rather than having to do it themselves. I mentioned earlier the LSB's report on SSB, and clearly, I think it validates the fact that complaints are an early warning indicator. Now, it's obviously made its view the LSB's made clear its view that the complaints that the SRA were receiving should have been a warning to the SRA rather than signposted to the legal ombudsman. But that's that decision. But what's interesting for me is the fact that it clearly demonstrates those complaints are an early warning. So then for me at the OLC, hopefully, I would want to know, well, what information are we collecting this data? Are we sharing this data? And are the other bodies that we're sharing it with using it? And that, I think, is a role for the OLC to be proactive on. And, and then within the individual cases that the legal ombudsman is investigating, I think there are some really interesting observations coming through around after the event insurance, around conditional fee arrangements, that are worth sharing and people reflecting on, well, how's this system work and what's it mean for the customer?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now that is, Blakeway, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for a very full answer to our questions. We have nothing else to ask you unless there's anything you want to raise with us.
Thank you for your time.
Matters. Thank you very much. And on that, I will draw this session to an end. Order.